Let's talk to the former Supreme Court Justice, Lord Jonathan Sumption, who joins us now. Good morning to you, Lord Sumption.
Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, you've been someone who's spoken out from very early days during the lockdown period about the issue of affecting our civil liberties in this country with lockdown. We've seen much starker, stricter lockdowns, much more strictly enforced in some other European countries without perhaps some of our sort of liberal backgrounds as we had. But you are particularly unhappy now about the new rule, came in at midnight, 23 minutes notice from the actual legislation being published, telling us that we can now, in England, only meet in groups of up to 6 unless we're at work or at school or, weirdly, playing sport. Tell us what your concerns are, Lord Sumption.
Well, the rule of 6 is not such an outrageous interference with civil liberties as the total lockdown enforced between March and June was. But it is objectionable because it's pointless, because it's arbitrary, and because it's unnecessary. It's pointless because without an army of snoopers and informers, it can't be enforced. And it's arbitrary because we're still being allowed to mix with much larger numbers of people in the workplace, in public transport, schools, the streets, shops and supermarkets. So that this seems to be a marginal measure at best, but it's intrusive enough to wreck a lot of people's basic interaction with other human beings. It's unnecessary because the recent surge in infections is being driven by younger people under 50, who with a handful of infections are not going to suffer more than minor symptoms or possibly none at all, and have much less chance of dying of COVID-19 than they do of ordinary seasonal flu. And that's why, in spite of the upsurge of infections, the rate of hospitalizations and deaths has hardly moved in this country and has only very slightly moved in other countries.
Well, we're told by the government, and the Prime Minister himself said he will do whatever is necessary to stop the spread of the coronavirus. We're told by Chris Whitty, Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor, that we're heading towards a second wave. And if we don't act now, we will see that second wave and many thousands more deaths. Now, you of course, are not, like me, a scientist or a doctor. But there are many people now in the scientific and medical community questioning the likelihood of a second wave, questioning how big a risk that is. Do you think that an awful lot of the evidence that it contradicts what the government is doing right now is being ignored to somehow justify these sort of infringements on our personal liberties?
I am not an epidemiologist, but then neither are the government ministers who have to make these decisions. We all have to look at the expert advice and form a view, that any citizen should feel at liberty to do that. Indeed, I think it's a moral duty that we should make our own minds up on these questions. But the problem is there is going to be an upsurge of infections, whatever we do. That is the lesson of the whole of Europe as well as of this country. A lockdown is the most severe form of social distancing imaginable. We have had lockdowns in this country for 3 months. Other countries have had even more severe lockdowns. What has been the result? Everywhere, the virus is resurgent now. These things make no difference unless they are held in place permanently and totally. In that case, you can reduce infections for as long as the measures remain in place, but you will have to put up with unimaginable social, educational and economic costs if you do that.
And these things aren't cost-free. There's quite a lot of a buzzing sound. I don't know whether someone's drilling outside your window or not, but I'm hoping we can resolve that sound issue. We've had talk also of these COVID marshals, local authorities hiring people, although no extra funding from central government for it, for people to ensure, without any actual powers, but to ensure that we do socially distance. Rather difficult to ensure people are following this rule of 6 in their own homes. I'm thinking if I'm sitting in my home and there happens to be a 7th person, I'm clearly in breach of the law of committing a criminal offence. But unless someone actually knocks on the door and verifies this and a police officer is brought along to find me, how can it be enforced? Do you think the issue of enforcing the law is actually one of the problems, which is that actually people think that if a law isn't enforceable, it's not worth paying attention to?
Well, I think that many people will feel that it's worth paying attention to the law because it makes sense. I don't believe that it makes sense, but that there are people who disagree. There are also people who, I would say, would be well advised to comply because they are particularly vulnerable on age or health grounds. But this is a decision which each of us should be in a position to make in the light of our own particular circumstances. We are not all the same, but the government's regulations treat us as if we were. We have different states of underlying health. We are of different ages. Some of us have had the disease already, others have not. This one-size-fits-all approach is deeply disruptive and unnecessary. It's much more efficient for everybody to make their own decision in a responsible way in the light of their own conditions and the conditions of those around them.
And what about the possibility of a legal challenge? We have seen some legal challenges brought by businessman Simon Dolan and others to the actual lockdown, which didn't really sort of see the light of day. But in terms of someone, say, choosing to go ahead with an event where there are, say, two families getting together and there are 7 or 8 of them and getting a £100 fine, refusing to pay it, facing a criminal record. Is there any possibility of a legal challenge? Would you, I happened to speak to some people last night who would be very happy to help fund, possibly even crowdfund, but help fund you if you wanted to bring some sort of legal challenge on this. Do you think that's likely?
I'm sure some people may try to do it. There would basically be 2 questions in a legal challenge. One is whether the government has power to do this at all. If they don't have power, then it doesn't matter how necessary it is. And the other ground of challenge would be to say that it wasn't necessary and was therefore a disproportionate invasion of people's human rights. I think that some of what the government has done, notably the lockdown, they did not have power to do, or they could probably have done it under a different statute and in a different way. I think that other things, less intrusive invasions on civil liberties, they probably do have power to do. I think it's very unlikely that the courts are going to decide whether it's necessary, because this is not only a difficult question, technical and scientific question, but it has to be weighed against all sorts of other social considerations unrelated to health, the social damage, the collateral medical damage, the educational and economic damage, and so on. And this is an exercise which courts are not well placed to carry out, and I suspect that the courts will recognise that.
They'll say it's outside their jurisdiction. The civil liberties aspect of this is very important, and I suppose becoming more important as the threat of the virus, the pandemic, has receded. Again, many people think that it is now resurgent. Again, there's an awful lot of medical and scientific evidence that is not the case in any meaningful sort of pandemic, global existential threat to the human race sort of way. But when a lot of people, and I include myself in this, were completely accepting of the need for a lockdown, there's some who always argued against it. I was of the view, Chris Whitty knows a darn sight more than me. There's a big concern. It's a virus we don't know much about. We should probably play safe. But again, for a few weeks, while the NHS, manages to get its act together and we can build up stocks of PPE, etc. Now that it has receded, there is the concern that the infringements on our civil liberties are now out of, even though this rule of 6 is far less than you have to stay in your home 23 hours a day, that these infringements are, as you say, unnecessary and not justified by the perceived threat. And we've seen this before with any infringement of our civil liberties in this country, that it tends to be used by the authorities far past its initial reason for being brought into being. Are you concerned that some of the civil liberties we have lost during this pandemic period will be lost forever?
Well, I think that what will survive the current crisis is a taste for coercion, because governments have learnt, our government has certainly learnt in the course of this crisis since March, that if you frighten people enough, they will, in large numbers, submit to your wishes. And power is intoxicating. This is a government which is completely obsessed with coercive remedies, even when other remedies are available. I can only describe Mr. Hancock in particular, who has driven most of these measures through, as a gimlet-eyed fanatic. There are many considerations other than health considerations which have to be taken into account, which are being ignored, and there are health considerations which are being ignored. In this morning's papers, we find new reports suggesting that the scale on which the lockdown earlier this year will have led to an increase in cancer deaths is really frightening. This is a one-track mind approach to dealing with a pandemic. And the problem with one-track minds is that you miss all the things that are happening in the other 6 tracks that you can't see.
Lord Sumption, very much appreciate you taking the time to join us. His former Supreme Court Justice has been raising his concerns about civil liberties throughout the lockdown period. So appreciate you joining us. Apologies for the quality of that line, but if you do want to watch that back again, we are streaming the show live on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Let's get the thoughts of James Price, who's listening to that. It's a former government special advisor, now at Hanover Communications. Lord Sumption has been one of the voices almost in the wilderness for many weeks, saying, look, this is a very big issue, our civil liberties, because we know what happened in Sweden is, they basically there are a few rules, but basically they said, look, this is what we advise you to do. We think you should do this level of social distancing, but we're not going to coerce you to do it. But normal life can continue if you so choose. That would have been an alternative option for us.
Gosh, what a way to fall from someone as amazing as Jonathan Sumption just to throw to me on this kind of question. But I don't think he said a single word that I could possibly disagree with. And it's just so refreshing to hear someone from such an eminent position talk about things like liberty and talk about responsibility rather than just coercion all of the time. I said this earlier on this morning. A great fear is that if we keep putting all these impositions on people and keep forcing people to do stuff and not trusting people, what kind of populace are we going to end up with? Yeah. This is a country that spread liberty, and the ideas of freedom around the world, and people in this country benefited enormously from being able to have a great say of freedom and responsibility over our own lives and our own actions. I think Lord Sumption is completely right, and we're at great danger of losing that if we stop trusting people, because by and large people will always do what's right and good and moral. And
the interesting thing actually is, because if you look back at all the graphs and the statistics over the period where we went into lockdown, people had already gone into sort of partial lockdown already, voluntarily, and having been advised, and actually we already saw hospitalizations and deaths go down. If you actually look at the period, the deaths that resulted 3 or 4 weeks on from when people actually started voluntarily looking down, that was we already passed the peak at that point before we went into lockdown. Now we know, because actually, as you say, people will do the right thing where it is necessary, but does it necessarily have to be a law? Well, we shall see.